You know the shape. Long bonnet, flared arches, side pipes running low along the sills. A silhouette so instantly recognizable that more than 50,000 people have built their own copy. Every single original was built in a Victorian factory beside the River Thames by British craftsmen in a Surrey town most Americans have never heard of. Carroll Shelby got the name. Then, in the early 1990s, Shelby obtained duplicate California government titles for 43 chassis numbers that AC cars had never manufactured. Ghost numbers, each worth $1 million on the collector market, and sold the cars built on them as original 1960s Cobras. When AC Cars went public with their accusations, Shelby sued for defamation. The legal war drove the company into receivership in 1996. The Thames Ditton factory is housing now, the cast iron pillars preserved inside a conservation area scheme because they were too well made to demolish. This is the story of John Weller, a Peckham engineer, and how the factory he built beside the Thames produced America's most famous sports car, and how the man who branded it spent years in court trying to prove he'd built it himself. Not through one battle, through 43 numbers that existed only in a ledger, a loophole in a California government office, and a legal bill that arrived when there was nothing left to pay it with. Chapter 1. The Engineer and the Butcher. The story begins with two men who had no business building cars together. One was an obsessive, self-taught engineer from Peckham. The other was a butcher from South London with £1,700 and a commercial instinct that would save the enterprise before it had truly begun. Between them, they accidentally built the foundation for one of the most consequential chapters in British automotive history. Neither of them would live to see what their workshop eventually produced. John Weller was born on the 28th of November, 1877, the third of 7 brothers, in Peckham, southeast London. He didn't come from wealth, and he didn't come from privilege, but he came with something that tends to matter more in the long run, an almost compulsive relationship with mechanical things. By his early 20s, he was traveling the country as a mechanic, fixing machines that most people couldn't yet explain, let alone repair. By 1899, he'd established Weller Brothers, engineers in West Norwood with his brother Harry, a workshop that had already been recognized as an official motorcar repairer for the Automobile Club. In the earliest years of motoring, when an engine stopping by the side of a road meant genuine uncertainty about how it might be persuaded to start again, that recognition mattered. There were very few people in Britain who knew what to do. Weller was one of them. John Portwine operated London and suburban meat stores. He was Weller's local butcher. In 1902, he bought into the workshop for £1,700 and became managing director, and the partnership thus formed had a simplicity that the subsequent decades would obscure. The engineer had the ideas, and the butcher had the judgment about which ideas were worth pursuing. It was Portwine who understood, before any prototype had turned a wheel, that what Britain's tradesmen actually needed wasn't a racing car. It was a van. The autocarrier appeared in 1904, a 3-wheeled commercial delivery vehicle, 636 cubic centimetres single-cylinder engine, tiller steering, a 2-speed epicyclic hub gearbox. Nothing here that would set a pulse racing, but everything that would set a ledger looking healthy. It solved a problem that horses and bicycles couldn't solve at scale, moving goods through urban streets reliably, cheaply, in quantity. Goodyear Tire and Rubber ran a fleet of nearly 100 of them. The British Army commissioned military variants. Companies across the country ordered them because they did exactly what they were supposed to do, and did it without drama, which was precisely the commercial virtue Portwine had identified. There is a version of this story where the engineer insists on building something magnificent and the company dies for lack of capital within 3 years. The butcher prevented that version from happening. By 1907, a passenger version had arrived, the AC Sociable, eventually built in approximately 1,800 examples at £190 apiece. The company renamed itself Auto Carriers Limited, and the AC initials were formalised. And 4 years after that, in October 1911, the enterprise moved, having thoroughly outgrown West Norwood, to Ferry Works, Summer Road, Thames Ditton, Surrey. The factory they occupied had been standing since the 1880s, built originally by Willans and Robinson, manufacturers of steam engines, and it carried a distinction that sounds modest now, but was genuinely remarkable at the time. Reportedly the first factory in the world to have been lit entirely by electricity. Victorian yellow stock brick, cast iron pillars supporting a pitched roof pierced by enormous skylights, the kind that drew cold grey English light down through the working day and made the floor below feel, on a good morning, almost generous. 63,000 square feet on 1.32 acres, with direct frontage onto the River Thames, where the water caught whatever light the Surrey sky was offering on any given afternoon. An engineer and a butcher had arrived at their permanent address. In those cast-iron pillars and those pitched skylights, a company would build itself, lose itself, and spend the better part of a century trying to find its way back. Chapter 2. The man who took credit and the engine that lasted 44 years. There is something appropriate about the fact that the man who first took credit for AC cars was a racing driver, not an engineer. Selwyn Francis Edge was born in Concord, New South Wales, Australia, on the 29th of March, 1868, and he approached most situations in life the way he approached racing, loudly, confidently, and with a very particular understanding of whose name should be at the front of things. He was a celebrated figure before AC ever crossed his path. He'd won the Gordon Bennett Cup in 1902, driving a Napier, 351 miles across, roughly 11 hours, through dust and heat and mechanical uncertainty, in conditions that would have defeated most men. In 1907, at Brooklands, he set a 24-hour solo record that stood apart from mere competitive achievement, 1,581 miles at an average speed of 65.09 miles per hour, changing tyres 24 times, the last change accomplished in 31 seconds. When Edge sold his racing business, SF Edge Limited, to Napier in 1912, he received £120,000 and a 7-year non-compete agreement. He spent a portion of that interval farming pigs in Surrey. Then he looked around for something else to conquer. He gained full control of AC cars by 1922, and within less than a year, he had forced out both John Weller and John Portwine, the two men whose combined effort had built the company from a West Norwood workshop to a Thameside factory over the previous 2 decades. The engineer who had designed the machines and the butcher who had funded them were gone. Edge renamed the company AC Cars Limited, put his own imprimatur on the enterprise, and then found himself in possession of something he hadn't built but couldn't improve upon: John Weller's engine. Weller had designed it during the First World War, a 6-cylinder unit of aluminium alloy construction, single overhead camshaft, hemispherical combustion chambers, dual spark plugs. He'd announced it in 1919 and put it into full production in 1922, the same year Edge was consolidating his takeover. The AC6 would remain in production until 1963. 44 years, through 2 world wars and the complete transformation of the global motor industry. Weller's patented spring slipper chain tensioner was quietly adopted across the wider industry. When the engine finally retired, at 1,991 cubic centimetres and roughly 102 horsepower, having started its life at 1,477 cubic centimetres and approximately 35, it had outlasted virtually every contemporary design in production history. Weller didn't live to see most of it. He'd been pushed out before the engine reached its full expression. The 6 was his monument, built in a factory he'd moved to, powering cars carrying a logo he'd helped establish, and his name was not on any of it. Under Edge, the cars raced. In 1921 alone, AC took 57 records at Brooklands, which is the kind of number that turns heads even in a sport accustomed to hyperbole. On the 1st of December 1922, J.A. Joyce became the first driver of a 1,500 cubic centimetre car to cover 100 miles in 1 hour, recording 101.39 miles per hour. In 1926, the Honourable Victor Bruce won the Monte Carlo Rally outright in an AC, the first British car to achieve a victory there. The following year, Mildred Bruce won the Ladies' Cup, having driven 1,700 miles from John O'Groats without sleeping. The cars were fast, reliable, and increasingly well regarded. Then, in 1929, Edge lost £135,000. The company went into voluntary liquidation. Into this collapsed enterprise, in 1930, stepped William and Charles Hurlock, South London haulage operators, described by contemporaries as car and truck dealers, who appear to have bought the remnants of AC cars primarily because they wanted the warehouse space. William liked a car that had been assembled from leftover parts. That fondness for improvisation was essentially the company's business model for the next decade. 631 cars built between 1930 and 1939, profitable in only one of those years, the whole operation sustained by cash flowing from the Hurlock family's other businesses. What the Hurlocks gave the company, inadvertently, was time. Time and a kind of unhurried craft that the market had not asked for, but that turned out, decades later, to be exactly the foundation the company needed. They called it, with a precision that sounds like understatement, but wasn't, the Savile Row of motordom. It was hand-built work for a very small clientele, produced without urgency, in a factory beside the Thames that still had the cast-iron pillars and the pitched skylights from 1880. The Hurlock family would control AC cars for the next 56 years. Chapter 3. The Shed, the Bucks, and the Most Beautiful British Sports Car. John Tojero was born in Estoril, Portugal, on the 3rd of December, 1923, the son of a Portuguese father who died when Tojero was young. He was raised in England, attended the Percy School in Cambridge, left without a single qualification to his name, and became an apprentice at Shelby and Drury, a company that made refuse vehicles. He learned to weld during the war while working on Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers with the Fleet Air Arm. Then, when the war ended, he set himself up in a shed behind Vin Davison's garage in Arrington, Cambridgeshire, and began building racing cars for other people. He had no wind tunnel, no testing facilities, no engineering department, and no business model that any conventional investor would have recognized as viable. What he had was a shed, a developing eye for chassis geometry, and a willingness to work with whatever materials and budgets his clients brought him. It would turn out to be enough. The chain of events that connected Tojero to AC cars is one of those sequences that looks, in retrospect, like inevitability, but at every stage felt like accident. Lionel Leonard had a Cooper MG with a body based on the Ferrari 166 Barchetta, a shapely, low-slung Italian coachwork design that had attracted considerable attention. The car passed to a man called Cliff Davis, who commissioned Tojero to build him a new chassis, this time for a Bristol engine. The resulting car, registered LOY 500, won 6 races in 1953. An intermediary named Ernie Bailey, who ran Buckland Bodyworks, saw it, recognized something, and arranged an introduction to AC cars at Thames Ditton. Tojero drove a demonstration car to the factory. The Hurlocks looked at it. They bought the car, hired Vin Davison, and negotiated a royalty arrangement with Tojero for the right to manufacture his design. The arrangement was, by Tojero's own later admission, the product of a man who was, in his own words, naive in business. He received £5 per car, but only on the first 100 cars produced. After that, nothing. A design that would eventually underpin one of the most celebrated automobiles in history, and the man who created it received £5 a unit on the opening century of production. The AC Ace debuted at the London Motor Show at Earl's Court in October 1953. First deliveries followed in May 1954. The chassis was twin 3-inch diameter tubular steel, all-independent suspension using transverse leaf springs, a configuration that gave the car a delicacy and responsiveness entirely at odds with what its modest power outputs might have suggested. The body was aluminium, hand-formed over wooden bucks by craftsmen at Thames Ditton, each panel shaped individually using English wheels and panel hammers and a knowledge of compound curves that no engineering drawing can fully capture. The design came from Eric George Gray and was refined for production by AC's chief engineer, Alan Turner. The Ferrari Barchetta inspiration was openly acknowledged. What emerged from the Thames Ditton factory was something sufficiently original to stand apart from its influences. To describe the process of building those bodies is to describe a form of craft that existed in very few places in Britain by the early 1950s, and exists in fewer still today. A flat sheet of aluminium under a skilled hand develops a personality. It resists here, yields there, needs to be persuaded rather than forced. The wooden bucks were templates carved to the exact final profile of each body section, worn smooth over years of use, each one recording in its surface the accumulation of every panel that had been formed against it. The English wheel ran back and forth, the upper and lower rollers gradually imposing a compound curve that spread across the sheet. Panel hammers rang against dollies held underneath. The smell was of raw aluminium, clean, faintly mineral, entirely specific. and the sound was the steady percussion of metal meeting metal in a rhythm that moved across the workshop like a conversation. The Ace raced. At the SCCA, it won 5 consecutive production championships between 1957 and 1961. In 1957, 27 of the top 35 SCCA championship cars were AC Ace Bristols. At Le Mans in 1959, Ted Whiteaway and John Turner finished 7th overall and 1st in the GT 2.0-litre class and drove the car to and from the circuit. The AC Coupe, announced in October 1954, was only the second hatchback in history. Eventually, 732 Aces of all types left the Thames Ditton factory, 220 with the original AC6 engine, 466 with the Bristol unit, and the remaining few with a Ford unit that pointed quietly toward what was coming. By 1961, the Bristol engine was being discontinued. As C cars needed a replacement, the replacement was already on his way. Chapter 4. The Texan and the Thames. Carroll Shelby had been a racing driver. Had been, because his heart had turned against him. He carried nitroglycerin tablets in his helmet to manage a condition that had no business being managed at racing speed, and eventually the prudent decision caught up with him. He retired in 1960, having won Le Mans the previous year, sharing an Aston Martin with Roy Salvadori. He was 37 years old, and he had already decided what he was going to do next. Build an American sports car that could defeat the Corvette. Chevrolet wouldn't help him. They had no interest in creating a rival to their own flagship. So Shelby went looking for a chassis, and the chassis he found was sitting on a drawing board in Surrey. In September 1961, Shelby wrote to Charles Hurlock at AC Cars outlining a proposition, a seized chassis, Ford's V8. Charles was the son of William Hurlock, who had bought the remnants of the company back in 1930, and he had inherited not just the business, but something of the family's cautious pragmatism. The timing, as it turned out, was almost cosmically convenient. Bristol had just announced it was discontinuing the engine that had powered the majority of the Aces sold in the American market. A C needed a replacement power unit. Shelby was offering one. Ford agreed to supply the V8 engines. The deal was authorized by Dave Evans, Don Frey, and Lee Iacocca, and Shelby borrowed $25,000 from Ford to get the operation started. The prototype, chassis number CSX-2000, was completed at Thames Ditton in January 1962. On the 2nd of February 1962, it was air-freighted to Los Angeles, where Shelby's team was waiting at Dean Moon's shop in Santa Fe Springs. The Ford 260 cubic-inch V8 was installed in under 8 hours. It's worth understanding exactly what the arrangement was, because everything that came later depends on that understanding. AC Cars in Thames Ditton built the complete chassis and body. They painted it, trimmed the interior, fitted all the mechanical components except for the engine and gearbox. They then shipped this completed rolling chassis across the Atlantic to Shelby American in Venice, California, where the drivetrain was installed and the car was finished for delivery. Thames Ditton supplied the structure, the shape, the craftsmanship, everything visible and tactile about the car. Shelby American supplied the power and the marketing. Before the public had seen a single production car, Shelby had already commissioned Dean Jeffries to repaint the prototype multiple times, yellow, red, blue, to create the impression, for journalists and photographers, that a fleet of cars already existed. The public debut came at the 1962 New York Auto Show. The car that emerged from the show coverage looked like a range, like a company with production running and momentum behind it. It was one car in 3 different paint jobs. The gap between the impression Shelby was creating and the industrial reality in Thames Ditton was visible from the very beginning to anyone who looked carefully. The cars raced with extraordinary success. In 3 years of USRRC competition, the Cobra lost only 1 race. At Le Mans in 1963, the cars finished 7th overall. In 1964, Peter Brock's Daytona Coupe, designed without a wind tunnel by a 22-year-old using a 1937 German treatise on aerodynamics by Wunibald Kamm, ran at 196 miles per hour on the Mulsanne Straight and finished 4th overall, winning the GT class with Dan Gurney and Bob Bondurant sharing the wheel. 6 Daytona Coupes were built. Each one was, by any measure, a work of engineering art produced under almost absurd constraints. The moment that most clearly marked the high point of what the Thames Ditton and Venice alliance had produced came on the 4th of July, 1965, at the 12 Hours of Reims. Bob Bondurant and Joe Schlesser, driving CSX 2601, clinched the FIA International Championship for GT manufacturers, the first and only time an American team has won that title. The Cobra program was, by any measure, a racing achievement of the first order. There was, however, a detail in the production process that registered very little at the time and would come to matter enormously. On the European market Cobras, a relatively small batch assembled entirely at Thames Ditton, the car bore an AC nameplate. But on the 427 series cars destined for the American market, Shelby had his own nameplates fitted and the AC plates removed. The car became, physically and documentarily, a Shelby product. The team in Thames Ditton who had built the chassis, formed the body panels, and assembled the rolling structure found their name absent from the finished article. 998 cars, every chassis and body built in Surrey, and on the majority of them, by the time they reached their customers, the name of the factory that built them was nowhere to be found. This was not, in 1965, recognized as the beginning of anything. It was a commercial decision by a man who understood branding. The seeds it planted would take 25 years to flower, and when they did, they would cost everyone involved more than anyone had anticipated. Chapter 5. The Ghost Numbers. To understand what happened in the 1990s, you need to understand a number, not a production total or a lap time or a price at auction. A chassis number. Specifically, you need to understand what a chassis number on an original Cobra actually was, what it looked like, and how easily it could be separated from the car it was supposed to belong to. The numbering system Shelby American used to track the Cobra production run followed a straightforward prefix logic. American market cars carried the CSX prefix, CSX 2000 through CSX 2702 for the leaf spring cars, CSX 3001 through CSX 3360 for the coil spring 427 series. British market cars used the COB prefix. Continental European exports used COX. On the earliest cars, the chassis number was stamped directly into the metal. On later cars, a small aluminium plate, hand-stamped, riveted to the chassis, carried the number. The last 3 digits were also scratched into hood latches and trunk latches. On many cars, an electric engraving tool had added them to body panels as additional identification. The physical reality was this. The number was a small piece of riveted aluminium. Aftermarket suppliers had been offering reproduction plates, available, as one catalogue put it, ready to be stamped with your own chassis and engine numbers, since before the cars had become genuinely valuable. This was not, in itself, a scandal. Replacement parts are replacement parts. But it was a vulnerability. The homologation requirement for the 427 Cobra's FIA racing program had specified a minimum of 100 road-going examples. The FIA's rules demanded that a car contesting the GT Championship be a genuine production vehicle available to the public, not a purpose-built racing machine in a streetcar's body. To satisfy this, Shelby submitted paperwork claiming a production run of at least 100 427 series Cobras. A C Cars at Thames Ditton built 55 of them, perhaps 56. The production ledger at Thames Ditton, a document the staff referred to simply as the Bible, recorded every chassis shipped. There were no unaccounted-for frames. There were no cobwebbed spares stored in a corner. A C confirmed this in writing. What existed on paper did not exist in metal. 43 chassis numbers, CSX 3058, CSX 3059 and 41 others, were valid designations in the production sequence. Shelby had made up manufacturers' statements of origin for 100 cars and kept the unused numbers in reserve. Each one was, by the early 1990s, potentially worth a very great deal of money. Original 427 Super/Sport Cobras were selling at auction for between $1 million and $2 million. CSX 2000, the first prototype, the air-freighted car that had started everything, would eventually sell at R.M. Sotheby's in Monterey in 2016 for $13,750,000, the most expensive American car ever sold at auction. 43 chassis numbers, each worth $1 million or more to anyone who could make them real. a physical identification system consisting of small aluminium plates and hand-scratched engravings that could be reproduced from aftermarket suppliers, an originating factory that had been sold, moved on, and was no longer in a position to litigate the history of what it had built, and a man who had created the numbering system, submitted the homologation paperwork, and still had access to the unused designations. The gun had been loaded for a very long time. What happened in 1991 was that someone pulled the trigger. Chapter 6. The car that couldn't sell and the sale that changed everything. Cobra production ended quietly in the autumn of 1967. The last American-bound 427, chassis CSX 3360, left Thames Ditton with no ceremony marking what it represented. The conclusion of a collaboration that had produced 998 cars, won an FIA championship, and created a silhouette that would outlast every institutional arrangement that had produced it. The reasons for stopping were practical: shifting American federal regulations on safety and emissions, the financial strain of maintaining the program, and a strategic pivot at Ford toward the GT40. The cars stopped coming. What replaced them, at Thames Ditton, was a long, grinding search for the next thing. Derek Hurlock, Charles's son, the third generation of Hurlock family ownership, was by the mid-1970s committed to a project that would have tested a company with considerably deeper resources than AC possessed. The 3000 ME was a mid-engined sports car, Ford V6, backbone chassis, angular body designed for an era that seemed to want exactly that sort of thing. It had been in development since 1972. It arrived on the market in 1979. The original target had been 250 cars per year. Over 6 years of production, the 3000 ME sold 71. The reasons were not difficult to identify. The car had taken too long to develop, absorbed too much capital, and arrived at a market that had moved on by the time it appeared. The specification that had seemed forward-thinking in 1972 felt ordinary by 1978. The price was wrong. The timing was wrong. Derek Hurlock halted production in 1984, and the last of the Hurlock family's 56-year stewardship of AC cars effectively ended there, not with a closing ceremony, not with a statement to the press, but with the quiet acknowledgement that the thing that had kept the company alive since 1930 was no longer sufficient. Into this situation, in 1986, came Brian Anglis. He had started, in the early 1970s, as a one-man Cobra parts operation, the kind of enterprise that begins in a garage with a catalogue and a conviction that other people want what you've found. He'd built Autocraft at Brooklands, where the circuit's legendary banked surface and the ghost of British motorsport history provided a peculiar backdrop for precision engineering. When the Hurlocks decided to sell, it was Anglis who bought the historic High Street works. The tooling, the jigs, the body bucks worn smooth by decades of panel forming, the manufacturing drawings, even, reportedly, the old Singer sewing machine that had been part of the upholstery operation. All of it transferred from Thames Ditton to Brooklands. Some of the craftsmen who had worked the floor in Surrey followed the equipment. Ford arrived with money and complicated motives. The Autocraft operation became a joint venture. Ford took a 52% stake, and the AC Mark IV went into production. Aluminium-bodied, Ford 302, V8, Borg, Warner, T5 gearbox, approximately 480 built between 1982 and 1996. A workforce that reached around 110 during the ACE production years. The cars were well made, the craftsmanship largely intact, even if the address on the letterhead had changed and the Thames was no longer visible from the factory floor. For a period in the late 1980s, it looked like a genuine revival. Ford owned both a 52% stake in Autocraft and the Cobra trademark itself. They'd bought that from Shelby for $1 in 1965, a transaction that would acquire considerable retrospective significance. They also maintained their relationship with Carroll Shelby. From 1990 onwards, Ford reportedly attempted to close down AC cars on no fewer than 6 occasions. The relationship between Anglis and his principal backer had curdled, most decisively when Anglis commissioned an alternative ACE design without Ford's knowledge. Ford withdrew. The financial backing that had been sustaining the operation disappeared, and in the gap that followed, a legal war that neither side had planned for began to consume what remained. Chapter 7. The Forgery War. In 1986, a journalist asked Carroll Shelby about the possibility of building new Cobras. His answer was unambiguous. "If anybody was going to build the Cobra again, it would be me," he said. "Believe me, I've had ample opportunity, but I've said no. It isn't right to the folks who bought the cars originally." He added, for clarity, "I'd never build replicas. It isn't right." The interview ran in Kit Car Illustrated. The quote was noted, filed, and largely forgotten. 5 years later, Shelby contracted with McCluskey Limited, an engineering firm in Torrance, California, run by Mike McCluskey, who had been Shelby's personal mechanic since the 1960s, to build 43 new chassis. The specifications matched the 427 Cobra's original dimensions. The chassis numbers matched the 43 ghost designations that had never been manufactured at Thames Ditton. The mechanism Shelby used to give these cars documentary legitimacy was a California DMV procedure that permitted duplicate titles to be obtained through a written declaration under penalty of perjury. The procedure did not require the vehicle identification number to appear in the DMV's own database. It did not require the physical car to be presented for inspection. A written declaration was sufficient. Shelby submitted declarations for 43 cars and received 43 duplicate California titles. The ghost numbers had been made real, not in metal because the metal had been cast in Torrance in 1991 and 1992, but on paper where the dates and the designations suggested something rather different. In 1992, the Los Angeles Times ran a feature on Shelby under the headline, "The Heart of a Gambler." The article gave the impression that Shelby was completing cars he had started back in 1965, cobwebbed frames hoarded for 27 years, as the framing had it. This was not what had happened. Shelby would later acknowledge that the chassis had been manufactured new by McCluskey in 1991 and 1992, and that no original AC frames had been involved. The AC Cars factory ledger, the document the Thames Ditton staff had called the Bible, confirmed it. There were no unaccounted-for frames. Every chassis AC had ever shipped was recorded. The McCluskey cars were new constructions carrying numbers that, on paper, connected them to a production run that Thames Ditton had manufactured 30 years earlier. Brian Anglis went public. In June 1993, Autocar ran his accusations in terms that left nothing obscure. Every Cobra, Anglis said, had been made by AC in the United Kingdom. Every chassis had been logged in AC's factory records. There were no leftover frames, no cobwebbed originals, no continuations of interrupted production. And then, the most explosive allegation of all, Shelby had previously approached Anglis himself about remanufacturing a batch of Cobra chassis. The instruction, Anglis claimed, had been to ship them into the United States labeled as washing machine parts. Shelby's response was to sue. His solicitor was Neil Cummings, later CEO of Carroll Shelby Licensing, and the legal strategy was precisely constructed. Get Anglis to repeat the washing machine allegation under oath in a jurisdiction where its truth or falsehood could be tested by cross-examination. Anglis was saying, publicly, that Shelby had asked him to participate in what amounted to fraud. If he could say it in court, Shelby's lawyers could confront it. If he couldn't, the allegation would collapse. What happened next belongs to the stranger corners of legal history. A mutual acquaintance in Texas, apparently sympathetic to Shelby's position, arranged to meet with Anglis and recorded the conversation without Anglis's knowledge. In Texas, one-party consent made this recording legal. In that conversation, Anglis allegedly admitted that the washing machine part story had been his own idea, a proposal he had made to Shelby, not an instruction Shelby had given to him. His public allegations, if the recording was accurate, had inverted the direction of the suggestion. When Shelby's legal team forwarded the recording to Anglis's lawyers, the litigation that had seemed headed toward a courtroom abruptly changed direction. The settlement was reached in December 1993, and both sides immediately offered competing accounts of what it meant. Autocar reported that the outcome had been in Anglis's favor. Neil Cummings, representing Shelby, claimed that the settlement had produced a written statement from AC Cars acknowledging Shelby American as the manufacturer of record for the Cobra. Both versions may contain partial truth. These things happen in settlements, particularly settlements reached between two parties who each believed, with some justification, that they had been wronged. What the legal process had revealed, regardless of its outcome, was the extent to which the question of who had built the Cobra was genuinely contested, not as a matter of historical record, where AC's factory ledger was unambiguous, but as a matter of commercial and legal identity, where the stakes were measured in tens of millions of dollars and the lines had been deliberately blurred over decades. The 43 McCluskey chassis were eventually designated as wholly North American construction and sold with the restriction that they be used as off-highway race cars only, not street legal, not eligible for public road registration. 2 were offered for sale in Japan at prices between $275,000 and $492,000. The designation tells its own story. These were cars that couldn't quite be sold as what their documentation implied. 3 years after the settlement, in 1996, as AC Cars was entering receivership, Shelby said, "I proved in the courts 2 years ago that my firm manufactured the Cobra, not AC. The Thames Ditton factory ledger recorded 998 chassis, every one of them built in Surrey. The claim was made anyway." Chapter 8, The Factory the Thames Forgot. The legal costs had arrived at the worst possible moment. As C Cars under Anglis at Brooklands had been carrying, since the early 1990s, the weight of a development program that had run badly over time and badly over budget. The new ACE had been announced in 1986. It had been promised for 1988. It had finally launched in 1993. In the years between announcement and delivery, it had consumed resources that a small, specialist manufacturer with a difficult relationship with its major shareholder could not easily regenerate. When the cars finally arrived, approximately 46 to 50 were built. Against a development investment that had involved years of engineering and negotiation and restructuring, 50 cars was not a recovery. It was a confirmation. Ford had already gone. The 52% stake, the financial backing, the relationship with the larger corporate structure, all of it withdrawn after the disagreement over the alternative ACE design. The early 1990s recession had compressed the market for hand-built British sports cars that cost more than most people earned in a year. The legal dispute with Shelby had added costs that arrived precisely when no costs could be comfortably absorbed. In March 1996, AC Cars went into receivership. Brian Anglis had, in the months preceding, sold a large motorcycle collection, a vintage Bentley, and other personal assets in an attempt to save the operation. The money wasn't enough. The receiver arrived, the doors at Brooklands closed, and the enterprise that had been making cars since 1901, that had survived 2 world wars, the Depression, the cancellation of its engine supply, a Texan who removed its nameplates, and a legal war over 43 chassis numbers that had never physically existed, could not survive the combination of ruinous development costs, a withdrawn backer, and the particular cruelty of a recession arriving at the precise moment when everything else was already failing. The ferry works at Thames Ditton, the building with the Victorian yellow stock brick and the cast-iron pillars and the enormous skylights, the building that had been the first factory in the world lit by electricity, the building where aluminium had been hammered over wooden bucks into car bodies for 60 years, had already been sold. It had been converted. Walk past it now and you'll find residential development, the original structure incorporated into a conservation area scheme, the architectural fabric preserved, while the purpose that animated it vanished entirely. One lime tree from the original grounds can still be identified. It has no plaque. Anglis departed for Jersey, and later for New Zealand. In 2023 or 2024, tributes appeared marking his death. Octane magazine, in May 2024, wrote that he was likely to be remembered as much for his lengthy legal scuffles as the cars he produced. He had bought the tooling, hired the craftsmen, kept the name alive through a decade of Ford money and Ford complications, and lost everything trying to build a new car that the market never gave him adequate time to sell. Whether the washing machine allegation was his idea or Shelby's, whether the settlement acknowledged him or contradicted him, he had spent the last years of his involvement trying to defend a historical claim that was entirely accurate. AC Cars had built every Cobra that ever existed, and the world had mostly forgotten. Carroll Shelby died on the 10th of May, 2012, aged 89. Chapter 9. Malta, the Caribbean, and the Long Way Home. A company that had occupied a single Thames-side address for 75 years became, after 1996, a nomad. In December of that year, Alan Lubinsky, a South African businessman operating through a company called Pride Automotive, acquired the AC brand and what remained of the operation. Production continued at Weybridge in Surrey under the name AC Car Group Limited. The cars being built were handmade in a tradition that stretched back to the English wheel and the wooden bucks. Body construction alone required approximately 750 man-hours per vehicle. Around 61 Cobras were built at Weybridge. A Mark IV, an Ace, only 12 completed. A CRS with a carbon fibre body. An AC 212S/C with a Lotus twin-turbo V8. The craftsmanship was, by all accounts, genuine. The commercial foundation was less secure. By 2001, the Brooklands factory had been sold and the operation had moved to Albany Park in Frimley, Surrey. The following year, AC Motor Holdings Limited was incorporated in Malta. By 2004, a factory had opened at Hal Far on the island for the production of the carbon fibre ACM-KV. Approximately 2 cars were produced. Lubinsky left Malta reportedly owing around €550,000 to Malta Enterprise, the government investment body, with additional debts outstanding. The factory closed. In 2003, in a détente that surprised most people who had followed the preceding decade's legal warfare, Lubinsky and Carroll Shelby had reached an agreement to produce authentic Shelby AC Cobras together. Hand-built aluminium bodies by AC, the CSX 1000 and CSX 7500 series. First deliveries came in July 2004. In May 2006, Shelby sued Lubinsky for breach of the license agreement. The partnership that had seemed to offer a version of reconciliation between the two threads of the Cobra's history ended in litigation, as so much had before it. Acedes Holdings, LLC, was incorporated in St. Kitts and Nevis, in the Caribbean, in August 2008. By approximately 2013, AC Cars, EU, Limited, had established itself in Cyprus, backed by Sir Jeremy Mackenzie, a former senior British Army officer, as chairman, with production of the AC 378 GT Zagato and Cobra 378, contracted to High-Tech Automotive in Port Elizabeth, South Africa. AC Automotive, a separate entity in Straubenhart, Germany, built the AC Mark VI with a General Motors 6.2-litre V8 and Corvette brakes. That operation entered liquidation on the 24th of July, 2023. In the space of 27 years, the company that had occupied one Surrey address since 1911 had been registered or operating in the United Kingdom, South Africa, Malta, St. Kitts and Nevis, Cyprus, Germany and South Africa again. Each new custodian had arrived with intentions, announcements, and some version of the promise that this time the revival would be real. None of them were dishonest. None of them succeeded. The pattern: promise, production in small numbers, financial difficulty, departure, repeated with a consistency that suggested the problem was structural rather than personal. A company built around handcraft, low volume, and a heritage that other people were simultaneously exploiting and diluting is not an easy thing to make commercially viable, regardless of the address. Chapter 10: The Phoenix and the Lime Tree. In December 2020, a Swiss national named David Konzer was appointed Chief Operating Officer of AC Cars. By August 2022, he was CEO. The operating entity was AC Cars, England, Limited, registered at Unit 5B, Western Paddock, Donington Park Race Circuit, Castle Donington, Derbyshire. In February 2023, a deal was signed with Donington Park for a new United Kingdom headquarters and research and development centre, including a brand centre, an archive, a driver academy, and race operations facilities. The car they announced, on the 12th of May 2023 at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium in London, was called the AC Cobra GT Roadster. The chassis was an all-new extruded aluminium space frame. The body was full carbon fibre, weighing less than 50 kilograms. Icona Design in Italy had drawn the shape. Under the bonnet, Ford's Coyote 5.0-litre 5.8, 454 horsepower in standard specification, 654 in the supercharged variant, 0 to 60 miles per hour in 3.4 seconds. A top speed of over 170 miles per hour, from £195,800 excluding VAT, with the fully optioned supercharged version approaching £285,000. 250 cars per year planned. The The first year's allocation was sold by early 2024. The launch specification was named Edition 63, a reference to the Le Mans class victory of 1963, and painted in AC blue. Production commenced in 2024 at a facility on the UK's south coast. First deliveries arrived in 2025. In February of that year, a production partnership was signed with T Engineering at the former Saab factory in Trollhättan, Sweden, an operation founded by ex-Saab engineers, 70% owned by Dongfeng, a British company built in Surrey, building cars at a racing circuit in Derbyshire, with a Swiss CEO, a South African chairman, and a Swedish production partner working in the shell of a dead Scandinavian car brand. The wandering years had not entirely ended, but cars were being built in Britain again, and the Ford Vi8 in the engine bay would have been, to Charles Hurlock, entirely recognisable. Of the 998 original Cobras, the majority of which were built in Thames Ditton by craftsmen who hand-formed aluminium over wooden bucks and rarely saw their name on the finished article, more than 50,000 replicas now exist worldwide. Factory 5, racing alone, has sold approximately 6,000 kit versions. The ratio is roughly 50 facsimiles for every original. CSX 2006, one of the earliest Cobras built, was purchased by the jazz musician Herbie Hancock in 1962 with royalties from Watermelon Man. He still owns it. He is the longest tenured Cobra owner in the world, and the car has never been sold. Bill Cosby once borrowed a Super Snake, drove it once and returned it. The experience became an 18-minute comedy routine on the 1968 album 200 Miles Per Hour, which may be the only stand-up act in history that has contributed meaningfully to the mythology of a sports car. The Cobra has appeared in every major racing game franchise: Gran Turismo, Forza, Need for Speed, Assetto Corsa. It was in Gone in 60 seconds, in Ford versus Ferrari. Steve McQueen borrowed one and never bought it, which in retrospect seems exactly right. The Victorian factory on Summer Road is a conservation area housing development now. The cast iron pillars are still there, incorporated into the new structure because they were too well made to demolish. The lime tree from the original grounds is still identifiable to those who know to look. There is no plaque. A C-Cars did not die through one failure. It died through the departure of its founders, through a market crash that wiped out the man who replaced them, through a butcher's instinct to buy a warehouse in 1930, through an engine that lasted 44 years because nobody could afford to replace it, through a genius chassis designer paid £5 a car for the first 100, through a Texan who removed the nameplates and put on his own, through 43 ghost chassis numbers and a California DMV loophole, through a secret recording in Texas that nobody was supposed to make, through a new Ace that took 7 years and cost more than the company had, through a Ford withdrawal that arrived when everything else was already failing, through Malta and the Caribbean and Cyprus and Germany. It survived all of them, barely, intermittently, not always gracefully. Britain's oldest active car manufacturer, founded on the 8th of March, 1901, is building again, at a racing circuit in the Midlands, in a factory on the south coast, with a Coyote Vive 8 and a carbon fibre body that weighs less than a motorbike. The aluminium bucks are long gone. What isn't gone is harder to name. Call it stubbornness. Call it heritage. Call it the knowledge, held somewhere in the institutional memory of a company that has outlasted almost everything that tried to end it, that the shape was always worth preserving. 50,000 replicas exist because the original was worth replicating. 998 were built in Thames Ditton, and the world forgot who built them. Perhaps this time it won't.